Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. Today we're going to be talking about fly fishing voices. Who do you hear and who do you surround yourself with? And the impetus for that is the death of John Gierach, born in January of 1946, passing away on October 3rd of 2024. And even though I talk about books a lot on Casting Across, I've never reviewed a John Gierach book. I've never met the man either. But from those interviews of him that I've read or heard, I'm confident that he'd have a few sardonic quips about some of the superlatives I'm about to assign to him. I've never reviewed a John Gierach book because they're the best. His books are the best in the premier subgenre of fly fishing books. The quantity of paperbacks comprised of personal anecdotes and reflections is innumerable, and they're the natural outflow of the contemplative angler's experience. And while many do it, most don't do it well. For run-of-the-mill authors, chapters have the tendency to be tired variations on themes. For those who break through, a second book is still a rarity. But Gierach had over 20 follow-up books on fly fishing anecdotes and reflections. That is a telling statistic. Any used bookstore bears witness to his position among angling memoirs. Each random assortment of volumes features some of the popular and some of the obscure. But standing in a river waiting to stick, and even brook trout get the blues, will inevitably be there. In fact, if a second-hand bookseller's shelf doesn't have a Gierach book or two, it is safe to assume that there is another fly fishing section somewhere. A more poignant testimony to the man is his ubiquity. Fly fishers who don't read have read John Gierach books. His bibliography has the same footprint among anglers as the Gideons do in hotels. And that is the magic of Gierach's writing. Often, without the hook of a serialized story that tempts readers to push on to the next chapter, he draws people in. While he spoke to the common man in a simple way, there was a refined roughness that typified a literary skill. He wrote well. One must write well to write the same story hundreds of times and have people still read it with excitement. Experts and beginners, his contemporaries and teenagers, everyone read and everyone enjoyed his works. My first exposure to John Gierach was as a high schooler. A new fly fisher, I voraciously devoured any and every book I could get my hands on. My primary source of material was the Cascades Library in Sterling, Virginia. Once a week, my mother would drop me off at the library. I'd scour the stacks, read selected chapters, and take a pile of various fly fishing books home. If my memory serves me correctly, I think Where the Trout Are as Long as Your Leg was my earliest foray. Out of naivete and an abundance of caution, it took me a few years to finally check out Sex, Death, and Fly Fishing. Last year, I ran through All the Time in the World days after it was released. And although I've commented on a significant number of fly fishing books on Casting Across, I've never reviewed a John Gierach book. It would be redundant. It would be interesting. It would be cliched. I'm sure I could find things to pick apart. I do think he was a bit curmudgeonly, and I have some strong agreements with his worldview, but his books are so good. They are iconic, and no one wants to read 500 words that effectively say that. You'd be better off saving that time to read him, or, as I'm sure he'd agree, just go fishing. And that is what appeared on Casting Across earlier this week as I reflected on John Gierach after hearing of his passing. Now, there's a few things I want to talk about the man and about his works, and then also just kind of about who he was as an exemplar of a fly fishing voice. What do I mean by that? Well, I'll talk about that more here at the end of the podcast, but we have voices in fly fishing. There are very few anglers who simply get to their garage, get their gear, go fishing, come home, and that is the extent of their fly fishing. I'm sure there's some that are like that. They're effectively the hermit that lives in the woods, and they make an appearance at a fly shop where they get a package delivered to their front door, and that's how they get their tippet and their flies, and if their waders get a rip in them. But otherwise, they have no exposure to the outside fly fishing world. But I like to think, and I think that facts would back this up, that most anglers have a lot of exposure to the greater fly fishing world, and a great part of the greater fly fishing world is fly fishing literature. And just consider John Gierach as a voice in the fly fishing world. The phrase trout bum, which of course has been used and abused. I've written about how most people are not actually trout bums, and when you encounter one, you kind of wonder, is this the kind of person I want to build my life around? But that is a John Gierach-ism. And I would even say beyond that, just the ubiquity of his work, as well as the ever-present nature of his books, anywhere and everywhere you go, has influenced generations, plural, of anglers. I mean, his fly fishing works started in the early 80s and continued to be released until just last year. And I'm not sure of it, but I would imagine that there is something else in the work that will probably be published posthumously. Again, no details on that. I'm sure the information for that is out there, but that is what I can only assume. But that means there's 5 decades of fly fishing literature. He even had other works that were published in the 1970s, but for 5 decades, he persisted in writing and writing good stuff. Again, all the time in the world. The 2023 book that came out, I thought it was an excellent book. I kind of want to go back and read some of the early 80s stuff again and kind of have that fresh in your mind, compare and contrast with his writing style and what he has to say and what he makes emphases about. But I'll talk more about his books again at the end of the podcast today. The genius of Gierach, and again, I use that within the context of what he's doing, is his ability to tell fly fishing stories over 50 years, over 20 plus works, not, even including all of the magazine articles and all of the different other formats that he communicated in, and it not grow tiresome. There's times where I'm tired of my own thoughts about fly fishing and how I have turns of phrases that repeat over and over again in my head, and I have to fight against putting them on the printed page. And you may even see that or hear that in me in a way that I don't even hear that or see that in myself. But he didn't do that, and that is the mark of a good writer. And it's kind of a blessing in a lot of ways that we had someone like him in fly fishing, where certainly his skill set could have been used in a number of other ways. I know that he wrote about other things, but it really is very, very neat that within fly fishing we had a voice like that. Now, there are countless imitators of his style and attempts to kind of do what he did. And some are better than others. And I will say that there are some books over the last 50 years that I would say rank as good as or even better than some of the best John Gierach books. And it also goes and it's worth saying that there were books like his in the earlier part of the 20th century and even in the 60s and 70s that he probably drew a lot of inspiration from, books that I think are very, very good books. But none of that diminishes his achievements, his accomplishments, the merits of his writing and his books. Now, why is he so profound and prolific? Well, again, he's prolific because he's a good author, but that wouldn't matter if people didn't read it. There's a lot of good authors that people don't read. So certainly, he broke in at the right time. I mean, the 80s and 90s were the time. Late 80s, early 90s were the time to get into fly fishing. You watch River Runs Through It, and then you go to the library and you see, standing in a river waving a stick. And I don't know if that timeline wraps up well. Actually, it did. It would have been. But that was your kind of your starter kit, right? You got Brad Pitt and you got John Gierach. And he wrote in such a way that if you've been fly fishing for 50 years, that you'd say, okay, I know what this guy's talking about. And if you just started fly fishing, you could say he refers back to his early days of fly fishing and gently ribs those who are taking up fly fishing for the first time in a way that I can really identify with. And you didn't need to have some extreme level of technical prowess to get into his books. Now, I've read books that try to talk high level fly fishing, but then define terms in a way that the editor got a hold of that and said this person could not adequately communicate the essentials of fly fishing because they're writing at their level, and then the editor grabs it and really dumbs it down and distills it, and you get these really kind of painful interruptions to the flow of what would otherwise be a high level but good fly fishing book. Gierach didn't have that problem. He was able to explain things in a way that was not infantile, nor was it abrupt. It flowed into his writing. And I think that is, again, that takes skill, and that is something that's appreciated by people of all different skill levels. Something else that was very beneficial about the way he wrote, and I think spoke to a lot of people, is that it reflected reality. His situations were amazing, but if you fly fish for any amount of time, you can acknowledge that the amazing happens simply by being on the water. And the more you're on the water, the more amazing things potentially can happen to you. But I think kind of on the flip side of that, the more you're on the water, you can begin to understand and appreciate how much of the mundane is actually amazing. But then you add to that someone who has a real creative bent and who has a real way with words and communication, and you can really draw the amazing out of the mundane. And that's something that Gierach did well. And flowing through all of those stories, flowing through all of those anecdotes and through all of those books is a consistency. His home waters, the places that he travels, his angling companions, his companions in life, whether they be animal or human. But then there's also a rotating cast of characters and situations and circumstances. People that oftentimes the villains of the stories, if you could call them that, are one and done kind of characters. And there's a certain optimism in that outlook. And so I think that is another thing to appreciate, is that there's some consistency. If you go all the way back to some of his earlier works, you go back to something like Trout Bum from the mid '80s, and then you read something that came out here in the 2020s. Dumb Luck and the Kindness of Strangers was the other book that came out in the last 5 years. And there's going to be some things that are consistent, but then there's a lot of things that are different, which is a mirror for any of us who's been fishing for any period of time as we take the opportunity to look back on what we've done. So a few more words on Gierach before I kind of shift gears into kind of the greater perspective and how he is, again, someone we should be thankful for, but then how there are other examples of individuals like him and how they add to fly fishing. Because again, very few of us are simply us, rod, trout. There's more to it than that. And the thing that I would recommend about John Gierach is read some of his other stuff. Read him in magazines, and also consume information about him that is outside of his own hand. So interviews, podcast interviews, and in doing so, well, a couple of things are going to happen. First and foremost, and I say this with the utmost respect, but you're going to see that he is not, Uncle John, cheerful, chummy kind of guy. He does have a bit of a rough edge to him, but I imagine, and maybe give him the benefit of the doubt, it's because he's been asked the same question for probably 40 years, ever since he broke into popular fly fishing, asking the same questions about stories and people and his stories and characters and writing and his method and his rivers and all those sorts of things. So I would guess by the time you get to the last 10 years, he could have been tired of answering those same questions. But that doesn't mean that that's who he is. It's just an example of the complexity of an individual, and that's a good thing to know. And it's also helpful. So if that was kind of a negative thing, which certainly don't take it as that, it's just it adds to who he is, and that would be the other side of it. To hear his voice and hear his perspective on things in a little bit more of a candid, unedited way is refreshing, because it shows that this is not some sort of, AI produced work. The quality of a John Gierach book, these days almost could come across as sterile when in a world of subpar fly fishing books. And so to see that here's a man who, he goes backwards on his thoughts, and he thinks through things, maybe uses some rough language, maybe kind of dances around something, speaks very bluntly at times, has his hobby horses, but then he's able to produce a work that is just so polished and so good. I think there's something refreshing and beneficial to that. So that would be my other kind of recommendation for you. In a podcast where I usually only give one big recommendation, I've given you a handful about the late John Gierach, but that's something I would say. If you've read him a whole bunch, definitely dive into a podcast interview. There's not one on the top of my head, but if you Google it or you put John Gierach in your podcast search engine, you're gonna be able to find a number of interviews from the last few years where he talks about any number of things. I think he does kind of go unleashed in some of those podcast interviews, which is definitely worth a listen if you've only experienced him through his novels. And with that, I kind of want to transition to the second piece, which is going to be much more shorter. But again, Gierach has been a predominant voice in fly fishing, 80s, 90s, It sounds like a radio station, 80s, 90s, thousands, and today. So really the last, almost 50 years. And we have a number of other voices in fly fishing. You think of some of the prominent ones that we've lost even in the last few years. Someone like Lefty Kreh. But then you think of even someone like Tom Rosenbauer today. And there's a number of other consistent voices in fly fishing that are worth listening to, and for a few reasons. One, if anyone has staying power, you could be cynical and you could say it has to do with money, it has to do with the celebrity for being the sake of celebrity, but it's fly fishing for goodness sake. We're not talking about career politicians. We're talking about people who really love fly fishing. You don't stick with this if you want to get rich. You don't stick with this if you want fame, because fame in a fly fishing room is, you have the nicest flannel shirt and the same cheap can of beer, right? So it's not this huge pedestal you get put on. So if you stick with it, so the voices that you think were writing and were speaking in the 90s that are still doing it today, there's something to be said for that. And one of the cool things about that is because fly fishing is a small world, although we have our local fly shop, owner and our local guide, and maybe even our local, notable angler, the person who does really, really well and does so, who labors in relative anonymity for most of his or her angling or fly fishing career. There are a few voices that most people look to. Back in the days when it was magazines, it was the folks that would regularly contribute to the big national fly fishing magazines. Back in the day of the fly shop and the local fly fishing world being the nexus of the universe for the angler, it was the person that caught the most fish, and he would be willing to speak at the annual conservation banquet. But for the last, really 2 generations and a little bit beyond that, we have these significant voices, and they do a few things. They are usually the balanced voice. They are not the kind of person that is going to say something controversial to have that meteoric rise, only for it to burn out bright. If social media has shown us anything, in the last nearly decade of my kind of dipping my toe into the fly fishing industry through casting across, there's a lot of voices that have come and that have gone. There's a lot of people that have said a lot and then have just disappeared. And they may have had their 15 minutes of fame, but it's kind of you really have to weigh what they said when what they said was the only thing that they said, or they said it for a while and then they were gone. So to listen to somebody who has staying power, I think has a lot of value. It may not be as flashy. They may not do every interview. They may not be in as many locations as some other folks who have a recent toe in the door do. But there's a lot to be said for seeking out those voices that say something today, and they said something 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And to remember that also means that if you're listening to that person, there's a lot of other anglers out there that are listening to that person as well. And so it adds to kind of the community aspect of fly fishing. It adds to the culture being enriched by some of these steady landmarks and guideposts as far as individuals and figures, whether they represent a brand, they represent a conservation organization, they represent an area of the country, or all of the above. But having these figures in fly fishing is a good thing. So I'm not advocating a cult of personality. I'm not advocating hero worship because, like I've said, you're basically the biggest fall fish in the creek, is what it comes down to. However, there is something good about having voices that a wide number of people listen to. And in doing so, it really rallies people around the direction of fly fishing, especially when it comes to really important things like conservation and making sure that we're moving this to the next generation. So a lot of thoughts on kind of a scattershot of topics that all revolve around some of the best fly fishing writing and the best fly fishing insights that we've had in our lifetimes. So definitely go and read a John Gierach book. And with that said, I'm going to tell you what came out on Casting Across this week. The first thing that came out was I'd never reviewed a John Gierach book. It is the article that I read at the beginning of this podcast. There's not much more to say about that. Wednesday's article is called Firsts. I didn't write a whole lot because I was going to bed early after spending a long time getting all my hunting gear ready, and then I spent Wednesday morning in the duck blind. And so I have a couple of pictures about how that went and how, in a day and age when I'm not really putting a lot of time, energy, and effort into the opening day of trout season, because I fish a lot of waters that are open year round, it's kind of fun to have an opening day. This week's recommendation on the podcast. It's a multifaceted recommendation. The first one is read a John Gierach book. Or if you're not a reader, read a John Gierach book. You can do it. I promise you. And I'm not saying this to shame anyone or to belittle someone who doesn't read. You can do it. They're short. They're worth reading. Pick any one of them. And then you can say, oh yeah, I read John Gierach. And you can bare minimum. And if you really struggle with that, listen to one. As I've talked about before, on the podcast, there's a lot of ways you can do that for free and not in like any sort of piracy or stealing way, but there's a very good chance that your library has access to a service like Hoopla or Libby. Of course, if you do Audible, they're on there also, but I would recommend you check one out that way. I do both. I listen and read his works and a lot of other works as well. So that is kind of recommendation one. Recommendation two, and this is more of a kind of a service note for the podcast. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be having another accusations podcast. So if you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you have any accusations, if you have any book recommendations, if you have any book reviews, let me know. Matthew@castingacross.com. And if those come through, then I will gladly include a handful of them on this upcoming fly fishing accusations podcast. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe to your favorite podcast app and rate the podcast on iTunes and Spotify. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.